Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for Town and Country, A Tale of Two Patriots. My name is Lacey Villava. I'm the Education Manager at George Mason's Gunston Hall. I'm joined by Amy Durbin from the Marblehead Museum, who will be talking about the Jeremiah Lee Mansion. Just to give you a heads up about what our program is going to look like today, we're going to do a quick overview of each of our sites, and then we're going to talk about the style of those two homes and these shared but different features that we have in that style. We'll also be talking a little bit about the two men who lived in and owned these two sites. So let me tell you a little bit about Gunston Hall, and then I'll turn it over to Amy. Gunston Hall is today a 550-acre site in Mason Neck, Virginia, about 20 miles south of the District of Columbia. We are open all year round, and we are currently open for tours of 9 people or less, once an hour every day of the week. We are situated on the Potomac River, and in George Mason's lifetime, this space was inhabited by the Mason family, by people who were indentured to the Mason family, and of course, somewhere between 100 and 300 people who were enslaved at Gunston Hall. There are all kinds of stories to be told about what was happening here, and we're excited to be bringing you this segment of the story from Gunston Hall today. Amy, tell us a little bit about Marblehead.
Great, thanks, Lacey. So Marblehead today is located about 18 miles north of Boston. During Jeremiah Lee's time, Marblehead was the second largest city in Massachusetts and in the top 10 of all the cities in colonial America, which might become a surprise to some of you. Jeremiah Lee was not actually from Marblehead. He was born in Manchester, but Marblehead claims him as one of their own because of his service to the town and his service to the Patriot cause leading up to the American Revolution. So he's a beloved figure. This house that he owned and had built is actually one of 3 of our sites for the Marblehead Museum. So we're really excited to talk about it today because it only really gets a lot of love in the summer by visitors. Marbleheaders love it all year round. So it's really nice to be able to highlight the architectural pieces of it today with Lacey at Gunston Hall.
Well, I'm really excited to be taking us in and looking at these two homes. I don't know about you, Amy, but I love talking about Gunston Hall. I love talking about the style of Gunston Hall. And the style is called Georgian. Georgian refers to the time period in which these homes were built. It is gets its name from the Kings George, all of them throughout the 18th century. And influences quite a bit of architecture across the British world in the 18th century. So we're going to take a look at how the Georgian style was formulated in the 18th century.
Yeah, it's working.
So we're looking here at an image of a Roman temple, unidentified somewhere in the Roman world, painted in the 18th century by Heneage Finch, the 4th Earl of Aylesford. You can see some stylistic elements that if you are used to looking at many modern American buildings, particularly government ones, that look really familiar to you. Things like the columns and the decorative work up at the top. So in the 18th century, we started seeing these columns become part of 18th century home architecture as well. You can see those columns being mirrored again in this frontispiece or the front page of this book, The Vitruvian Principles of Architecture. The columns are also topped by a design element called a pediment, and we'll see those both at Gunston Hall and at Jeremiah Lee. And here we can see how they start to become part of the Georgian style of architecture in the 18th century. This unidentified house, but I believe is in London. You can see some of those stylistic elements that we were looking at in that Roman temple ruin in the image previous. You can also see those arched pediments coming up here, every other one. These triangular topped ones, those are also called pediments, and we definitely have some of those at Gunston Hall. The style of architecture leads us also to think about the lifestyle of the Romans and the Greeks. And we also see lots of connections with the beliefs about government and structure of society in 18th century America as well. So as we move through, we'll look at that and we'll talk about that in the symmetry of the Georgian style as we talk about both Jeremiah Lee Mansion and Gunston Hall. So Amy, tell us a little bit about the Georgian style as we see it at the Jeremiah Lee Mansion.
Yeah, so this is a really great shot of the Jeremiah Lee Mansion. We are looking at the west and south sides of this mansion. Georgian style is all about symmetry. So if you were to slice this house in half, it's going to look pretty much the same on both sides. What's interesting about the mansion here is that it's a 7-bay across. You'll see the 7-window bay across on the south side there. Typically it's 5, but Jeremiah Lee went with 7. And it's really great because, you know, when I think of the word townhouse, I think of like an actual townhouse with like houses, like row houses. And so for us to call this a townhouse today, it's kind of boggling my mind a bit. But Jeremiah Lee decides that he's lived for quite a while in Marblehead. He has amassed a large fortune in the shipping of fish, salted cod across the Atlantic, and he decides he needs to build a home to resemble, you know, where he is in life. And so he undertakes the construction of this home from 1766 to 1768. So if you can do math in your head, it's 253 years this structure has been in place. And what's really interesting is that he has a granite foundation. He's got 3 floors plus a basement and an attic and an octagonal cupola. So he is on the coast. He is involved in shipping. He wants a nice visual from the roof to be able to look out across the water. So nice cupola there. From a distance, you'll see the pediment that Lacey had mentioned and some columns on that front door part right there on the south side. That's your main entrance for visitors. The family entrance you can't see, it's on the opposite side, the east side, but we'll talk a little bit about that later on. And then I want to talk about an interesting thing. So there are a couple of cheats that Jeremiah Lee employs when it comes to his house construction. First off, the row of windows, the 3 by 3 that we see on the west side there, that center window in the middle, it's kind of a cheat window because it actually doesn't go into one specific room. There's like a false wall behind there. So if you ever get to visit the mansion and you come into the second floor on your tour, you'll see that there's actually a divider right behind that window because it doesn't really fit into any one specific like room, which is pretty cool. Second, from a distance, does this house make you think that it's built of wood or stone? So for those of you who might have guessed stone, I hate to say it, but you're actually wrong. We zoomed in on an image here, and what Jeremiah Lee did was, first off, New England has a lot of timber, so they're going to use that for a lot of their construction projects. But he wants to make it look like the stone that you saw in the architecture drawing that Lacey had previously shown. And so it's cut to resemble stone, and then they used gray paint, and then as the paint was drying, they tossed or flecked bits of sand in to give that granular look. What's really interesting too is another famous house, several houses use this, but another famous house that many of you must have heard of, I hope, at some point, is actually Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon uses the same rusticated cheat of it. We're gonna make wood look more expensive to make it look like stone, and so that's what Jeremiah Lee did.
I love it. And here at Gunston Hall, there's a little bit of stone incorporated on this house, but just a tiny bit. We've got some stone here on the edges. This is Aquia sandstone, quarried here in Virginia, about 40 miles south of where Gunston Hall stands. This house, you can also see that symmetry going on. We've got the 5-bay, as Amy was talking about, paired windows and that center door or dormer on the half story above. Built out of brick. Brick was really common in the 18th century. You may also have noticed that the chimneys in the Jeremiah Lee Mansion are centered on the house, whereas we've got these 4 paired chimneys on the ends of the house here at Gunston Hall, which I think is a really fascinating shift in construction based on north and south. You'll see lots more centered chimneys in the north and lots more gable end chimneys in the south. We've also got, there's one of our pediments here at Gunston Hall, right above the door there. We'll see some more as we go through the house as well. But just like at Jeremiah Lee Mansion, George Mason cheats a little bit with his symmetry. So if you look really closely here, all the way up the side of the wall, these are between the 2 windows on the wall closest to us from the last picture, He's got 2 shortways bricks pressed together that gained him several inches on the inside of the house. So one room in the house is bigger than the other because he does this on 2 walls at Gunston. So the dining room that we'll be seeing a little bit later in our program today is actually the biggest house here at Gunston, our biggest room in the house here at Gunston Hall. So we're going to take a look at the insides and the features of these houses and talk about a little bit about what they looked like, some similarities that they had, but also how they differed and a little bit about why they differed. So we'll start with service staircases.
Great. So what struck me when I first started working at the museum was that this mansion has quite a number of staircases. There's actually 4 staircases today. One's not being shown here because we're pretty sure that it was added later. But just imagine 4 staircases in one mansion. That's a lot, right? I mean, how many do you have in your house today? Probably 1, maybe 2. But 3 main ones, or 3 staircases that were used in the 1700s was a lot. The first photo that you're seeing is if you were to walk in that front door of the house we showed earlier, this is the entryway that greets you. This is Jeremiah Lee saying, I built this really big house and I have a really nice entryway and it's beautiful. And then you see this main staircase here. The staircase here is actually going to lead you from the first floor to the second floor. The landing there is going to have 2 life-size portraits of Jeremiah and his wife Martha. The originals are actually at the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, Connecticut, so these are reproductions. But it's a really nice staircase, and this is your main staircase that your guests are going to use and your family members are going to use. But in the middle is the family staircase. Okay, this actually leads you in the family side entrance that I mentioned on the east side. It goes from the first floor to the second floor to the third floor. So it's 3 floors on this staircase. And what's interesting too, the one thing that I really like about the Jeremiah Lee Mansion is that its wallpaper is still intact. So we've got hand-painted wallpaper, and we've got block-printed wallpaper. The family staircase would have had a block-printed wallpaper with the chinoiserie style pagodas on it. And I know that Lacey wanted me to mention this because it's a pretty fun fact, is that during conservation on the wallpaper, they actually found some of the wallpaper tax stamps on the back. The fun thing is that the tax stamps for wallpaper tax was from 1712. And unlike the taxes that the Patriots were protesting in the 1760s and 1770s, the manufacturer of the wallpaper paid the tax, not the purchaser, which is pretty interesting. And so that center staircase is going to be predominantly used by families. And the third staircase is that really kind of thin one that you see on the far side of the screen. I don't have a better shot of that, I'm sorry. But the staircase, as you might be able to tell, is in the closet. So this is actually in the housekeeper's room. And this staircase would have run from the 3rd floor to the 2nd and then down into what we think would have been the kitchen. There's a closet in the kitchen that would have most likely had the staircase going down there. So you've got 3 different staircases in this mansion, depending on what your rank and level are while you're inside the house.
This is so exciting. I mean, I love looking at that wallpaper and I love talking about our staircases, and ours at Gunston are really fun. Now, before I get into them, I do want to take a moment just to remind everyone, if you have any thoughts or questions, if you didn't send us to them before the program started, feel free to put them in the comments below and we'll answer them as we get closer to the end of the program. So we're now looking at the staircases here at Gunston. I selected the one from our Google 360 tour on Google Maps. So if you're interested in getting a little bit closer look at some of the things we're talking about today here at Gunston Hall, you can do that on Google Maps. We've also got this really awesome wallpaper in the central passage, this main hallway with that pillar and arch style on it, reminiscent of that Greek and Roman architecture that we were looking at earlier. But what I particularly love about our 2 staircases from the 18th century are we've got this main staircase in that central passage, very much in the same style of Jeremiah Lee Mansion, but it talks to the service staircase. You can see, looking at the bottom of the central staircase, you can see the service staircase in the background. And then on the right-hand side, you've got a little close-up view of that narrow, tight, windy service staircase. Of course, in the 18th century, you have to imagine that there was no light in it. That is a modern safety feature that we have added. But there's also this thinking about who was using these staircases. Of course, that just like at Jeremiah Lee Mansion, the formal staircase is being used by the Mason family and their guests. There is no family staircase though, so they're chiefly probably using this big staircase. And then of course the smaller staircase is used mainly by people who are in service at Gunston Hall. And there were a variety of people who might have been using this staircase, including people who were enslaved at Gunston Hall, like the young women, Pris and Penny, who were enslaved to two of the Mason girls, or the governess, Mrs. Newman, or one of the tutors, perhaps, if they had reason to be in the house, and as well indentured servants who were serving at Gunston Hall, all were using this staircase. Thinking about those kinds of spaces, there's a lot of work going on at Gunston Hall and Jeremiah Lee Mansion. So let's take a look at the kitchens. So we're working to support the house.
So here we have a photograph of the kitchen of the Jeremiah Lee Mansion. It's interesting, I had worked in other historic houses, especially in the South. I'm so used to having a separate kitchen. So it was really interesting to see that this 1768 kitchen was inside the house. It's a pretty decent size as well. I want you to imagine a floor plan. So it's 4 rooms on the first floor. And this is going to be in the far back corner. This is going to be on the family side, so like the east wing of the house. If you want to divide into like west and east wings, there's going to be a door from the kitchen into that main entryway across the hall from Jeremiah's office. There's going to be a door to the family entryway, and then there's going to be a door to the back of the house as well. And so, you know, this is a townhouse. The Lees don't have as much land as they do as we show it is today. So if you've ever visited the mansion, you'll probably be, you know, amazed by the amount of land around it and the gardens, the wonderful gardens. The Lees did not own all the space that you would see today if you came to visit. So they're gonna probably get a lot of their food from vendors in town. So they're not gonna grow very much of their own food. But they're going to do a lot of cooking because the Lees had 5 children living with them. Their oldest son was off in college at Harvard. So it was Martha and Jeremiah and 5 of their 6 children there. If we want to go to the next slide, you can just see this is another angle. This is behind what you saw, or sorry, across the room from what you saw in the previous shot. So it's a pretty significant size kitchen. There is mention of probably an outdoor, either bake kitchen or a laundry. Highly unlikely that it was going to be used predominantly every day for their cooking. So this is the kitchen that we are pretty sure that it's going to be used every day.
And then of course at Gunston Hall, as Amy mentioned, a home in the southern part of the newly forming United States. The kitchen's outside. So we're standing in the Riverside Garden, which we're currently restoring here at Gunston Hall in order to look at that kitchen. So we see the house straight in front of us, and off to the right, that smaller building is the kitchen. In the same way as the Jeremiah Lee Mansion, the kitchen is located on the side of the house more strictly used by the family. So the 2 windows on the right we're looking at are Mr. Mason's office. On the opposite side of that is the bedchamber, and then the kitchen is outside on that side of the household. The garden that we're looking at right now, if you come to visit us at Gunston Hall, doesn't look this way. This is pre-restoration, and we are currently in the process of putting this back to the way we think it probably looked during George Mason's lifetime, which was both beautiful and functional. It supported the eating habits of the Mason family. So produce, fruit and vegetables and medicines that were used by the Mason family were grown here in the garden that we're standing in this image. If we look at the inside of the kitchen, I decided to take this picture because it's a clear evidence of a good reason why kitchens were outside in the 18th century. These poor young ladies and I were sweating so badly on a deadly hot August day, and there was no fire going in this kitchen. Now imagine adding a fire to that as well. So you're hauling the dishes around that you see in the background, pouring water to wash those dishes, cooking over the fireplace, very much like the one you saw at the Jeremiah Lee Mansion. It's hot. And you don't want that heat in your elegant, beautiful house. This is also an opportunity to separate labor from beauty. The people who were working in this kitchen were most likely people who were enslaved. There were probably 5 to 7 people who were enslaved, regularly working in this kitchen and feeding the Mason family in the house just a few steps away. But there are other kinds of work going on in these spaces as well. So why don't we take a look at the office spaces, the business spaces for the men of the house.
Really excited to talk to you all about this space. So a lot of people might not know, unless you are Marbleheaders and you're watching, and hopefully you're learning this either by visiting us or in class. Jeremiah Lee was a Patriot. He was also a Justice of the Peace in Marblehead. He was Colonel of the Militia. He was on the Committee of Supplies with Elbridge Gerry, who you can see in that far room there. And he was also involved in securing arms and ammunition for the Patriots. So he's pretty busy. So he's running his shipping business. He's working for the Patriot cause. And one might think that we could kind of make a comparison here. This main room is almost like a conference room for him. He's going to be meeting with clerks and merchants and captains of his ships. And then he's going to use an inner office or more of his private business. So if he's maybe writing a letter to a person in Spain where he's, securing arms, or he's, working on some work for the committee, the supply committee, he's got kind of an inner office and then that outer office there. I also want to kind of take this moment to point out that Jeremiah Lee actually is, like I mentioned, a Patriot. He's part of the cause, and he's actually in a tavern with Elbridge Gerry and some of his other friends from Marblehead when the British come through on their way to Lexington in April of 1775. And unfortunately, when they hide in the cornfield outside of the tavern, then the location of the tavern today is modern day Arlington, Mass. He catches a cold or some sort of fever, and actually he passes away 3 weeks later. So he passes away May 10th, 1775, right as the war is getting started. And unfortunately, he only lives in this house for about 7 years. So the house, again, takes 2 years to build. He's built this grand mansion, and he only lives in it for 7 years. But this is office space, and it's kind of set up that way for anybody who chooses to visit.
So our office space at Gunston Hall has some similarities, but it's also incredibly different. We are looking at a space that George Mason used regularly. Like Amy said about Jeremiah Lee, Mason is a staunch supporter of the revolutionary cause. He thinks very long and very hard about the ideals of the revolution. For most of his life, he is involved in being a justice of the peace and a magistrate of the courts locally, but he is also a member of the House of Burgesses, the colonial Virginia government. And then in 1776, he gets invited to the 5th Virginia Convention, which is responsible for drafting, and George Mason does most of that by himself, the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And he continues to think about rights and the structure of government and how they're meant to protect people for the rest of his life. And he's spreading out his ideas like this in the house. We know that based on a description that he left for us, telling us that he had some thoughts and ideas that he shared on paper, and he wanted his oldest son, George, to send them up to him in Philadelphia. And he says, I don't quite remember where I left them. They might be in the window seat. I might have shoved them in a bookcase. Here's what they're about. Make sure you don't mess up my organization, which I think many of us can connect with. Now, this space is not just his. George Mason shared this space with his family. This is the opposite angle of that same room, looking back out into the space, and you can see a dining room table set up with some chairs pushed up against the wall because they're not using them actively right now. This is a space right now that George Mason is using as his office. Although I can imagine that table set up and scattered with papers and George Mason's sons working as copyists and couriers of George Mason's papers sitting at that table. And I can also imagine him just sitting in this room working with his sons and writing this beautiful letter in 1783 when he knew they were going to win the war that said, I congratulate you most sincerely upon the establishment of American liberty and independence. Happiness and prosperity are now within our reach, but to attain and preserve them must depend upon our own wisdom and virtue. He's really concerned about what's going on with the revolution. He wants to make sure that we don't lose the ground that we've gained as Americans. And I think that's really amazing to think about happening in this space amidst his family. But business didn't just take place in offices like these. Business also took place during conversations at celebratory events. So let's take a look at the formal spaces in each of these two houses.
I think for anybody who's ever been lucky enough or had the opportunity to visit the Jeremiah Lee Mansion, the Great Hall, as we call the formal space here, is pretty amazing. It's kind of like the gem of the whole building, in my opinion. I will have to ask you to use your imagination, though. Later owners, who thankfully did preserve the mansion, they also painted it. So this color is not accurate to what it would have been like for Jeremiah Lee. So it would have been a lighter tan color, maybe like an ochre light yellow. But the really cool thing is the breastwork above the chimney piece there. The carvings are original. And what Jeremiah Lee did was he basically looked through a design book and he's like, I want that one. And so it was carved and it's intricate. It's Rococo style. And it's pretty impressive in person. This photograph doesn't really do it justice, but you do get to see some of those intricate carvings there above the fireplace. We do have a couple items that are original to Jeremiah Lee, which are these chairs. Unfortunately, when Lee passed away, we have no list of the possessions that he had when he sold everything. So it's mostly guesswork in provenance when we can find it. We know for the chairs at least. But what's really cool too about this this room is George Washington actually visited here. He visited Marblehead in 1789. He's president. He's taking a tour of the states, and he has a slight affection for Marblehead. Marblehead during the war had about 600 of its men go off and serve. General Glover actually led them across the Delaware. So when you hear about Washington's famous crossing of the Delaware, those are Marblehead men rowing those boats. Marbleheaders are helping out in a lot of the battles, and so Washington wants to visit Marblehead. And so he actually visits in 1789. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, Jeremiah Lee is no longer with us at that point, but his wife Martha is there. And so she receives the general, and there's a party thrown in his honor in this space. And they even served him a cold collation that afternoon. And then other significant visitors to the house are going to include Presidents James Monroe and Andrew Jackson, and even the Marquis de Lafayette, who actually apparently got to visit twice. So it's a really great space. I mean, if you also use your imagination, you could probably see, a ball being held there. I mean, that's the kind of space that we're using here for this formal space. This is going to be the formal dining room. And it's just a very grand room to visit. You can kind of have a lot of memories or feelings evoke in this space of great men during Jeremiah Lee's time.
And then of course at Gunston Hall, because we've got to celebrate the differences, we have a separate dining room and a separate parlor. So we're looking first at the dining room. This style is called chinoiserie, and you'll see a few details similar to what you just saw in the Jeremiah Lee Mansion, but this style is very different in many ways. It's got this beautiful yellow ochre paint. I love this color, especially as the sun starts shining on it in the early afternoon. And this is a style that I think is really fascinating because it's not often seen in dining rooms. You may have noticed that there was a Chinese element to the wallpaper in the family staircase at the Jeremiah Lee Mansion when Amy talked about those elements. But here we have it splashed across a dining room. We also have these beautiful table settings. And what I love about this table right now is that it's actually not set for dinner. It's set because somebody is doing work in this space. And I can imagine somebody like Dick, who was a young enslaved man who served as a waiting man, or somebody who was present during dinner, getting prepared to serve dinner at a later point during the day, polishing the silver, getting it ready for that meal. And then of course, once the meal is done, everybody steps into the parlor for a conversation. And here we are in this beautiful parlor. I'm seeing a lot of Rococo design elements that are very similar to what exists at the Jeremiah Lee Mansion. Although, of course, instead of the wood paneling, we've got red fabric as a wall covering here, and all the woodwork is painted white. But they're in many ways very similar. I can also stand in this room and imagine the conversation that happened between James Madison and George Mason in December of 1783. The war had been won. We knew we were successful, but they were already seeing all of the problems of the Articles of Confederation, which was the government that preceded the Constitution. So there are conversations, thoughts, and ideas that are shared between these men whose houses we're looking at, and some similarities and some differences between their houses. So we're going to take a moment now to see if we have any questions from the comments on Facebook and answer those. So we have a question on Facebook. Are those leaves over the George Mason portrait? Yes. So the portrait is currently set for Christmas. So in the 18th century at Christmas, they laid holly leaves and other greenery on mantelpieces, in vases on mantels and tables, and often over portraits and mirrors. So we see that at Gunston Hall today. Amy, I am going to direct this one at you to start with. How did these structures escape fire? Did they ever have a fire that required repair?
That's a really great question. To our knowledge, there wasn't a fire that needed to have any repair work done, but Marblehead actually had a fire wagon or fire engine in the 1700s. It was gifted by the town, or gifted to the town by actually the leading Tory or loyalist, if you were, who was the brother-in-law to Jeremiah Lee. And so they were pretty cognizant of the fact that fires are going to occur in a town. So they were prepared with a fire wagon, fire engine, and then they obviously also had fire buckets, leather fire buckets.
We do know that there was a fire at Gunston Hall on the second floor. We're not entirely sure how much damage it incurred, but it did happen. Again, the leather fire buckets were a must-have in homes during the 18th century in order to ferry water from the well or another water source in order to put out fires. I see one that's kind of connected to this. Did either house suffer from any earthquake damage? I don't know about if you guys have had any earthquakes up in Marblehead, Amy.
It's not completely unheard of, but to our knowledge, we haven't had much damage from any movement of the ground.
Earthquakes are also not particularly common in Virginia, but some of you may remember that there was an earthquake in Germanna about 10 years ago. And we did suffer some earthquake damage from that quake. It's very minimal. It's surface plaster damage. I see one about the shelves in Gunston Hall above the doorways. So you may have noticed in the Chinese room, in the dining room, there were little brackets above the doors. We actually think those are for decorative elements, vases or other figurines, something decorative to be put in those spaces. Great question, though. We have a question, and I'm not actually sure about the answer. Can you confirm that there are self-closing hinges in the two houses? Supposedly the only two houses to have them.
Yes, we can confirm that because Lauren McCormick, who is also joining us, is saying that they are in the informal parlor. So that's going to be the family side of the house. So we showed you the Great Hall, which is the formal parlor. Across the hall, the informal parlor would have had the self-closing hinges.
And I'm not sure about Gunston Hall. I'll have to do a little bit more research and get back to you. And I think that is all of our comments on Facebook. So we are going to sign off, but before we do, we want to just let you know about some upcoming programs that we have here at Gunston Hall and at Marblehead. So our next program at Gunston Hall is a week from today. We start our Descent Made Material program on the 28th. We'll have 4 series of symposium style lectures, looking at how people have shared their ideas and messages through handcrafts over the last 4 centuries. And then in February, we bring back our History in the Kitchen program, where over 3 sessions on Saturday mornings, we will cook 3 different recipes from 3 different social levels out of the 18th century, things that might have been eaten by the Mason family, by free white people, and by people who were enslaved at Gunston Hall. Amy, what's going on at Marblehead?
We've got quite a full slate of programs going on for 2021. I do want to invite everybody to join us on February 18th for a talk about the power of the 3/5 clause with Professor Richard Bell from the University of Maryland. It's going to be a free event, so if you go to our programs page, you can register for that there as well. We're going to be starting our monthly Marblehead Memories programs back up again. And then we also have a 2021 book club series. The first one's actually going to be next Tuesday, be the last days of light. But we do have a meeting every other month and every book has been chosen. So again, if you visit our programs page, you can see all the wonderful events that we have coming up and see if you'd like to attend.
And lastly, I just want to say we thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. We also appreciate if you can make a donation of any kind to either of these museums. We offer our programs for free so that people can access them, but they aren't free to us. It takes time, effort, and money, and we really hope to be able to offer lots of these programs in the future. So if you are interested in donating to either of our museums, please do. It helps us put on programs like this one, research recipes for upcoming History in the Kitchen programs, uncover trivia questions to be asking you, and make these programs as fun and amazing as they are. So we do thank you, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.